the more powerfully the critic paints the ills of the society and the fragility of the self and the struggle it undergoes to be a human, the more powerful our account is, the more hopeless the people feel who could do anything about it. On the other hand, if we don't paint the account in such a powerful way, then people tend to underestimate what they're up against. So you've got a critic's dilemma. Foucault clearly has picked the path where he doesn't care if you feel powerless or not. That's your problem. You've got to do something about it. So he draws out all the mechanisms of control to the maximum so that you understand them. Okay, he wrote a series of books. I'm going to use one as an example of his thesis that knowledge and power are intertwined and the effects it has. And I will pick one of his most famous, but let me quickly give you a set of the books that he worked on. He wrote a book called Madness and Civilization, in which he pointed out the long history of how the discourse of reason had excluded from it the mad. Now, this history changes, as you know. In the medieval period, the mad are considered the way they are. How do the mad appear in Shakespeare's plays? The fools, the mad. Well, they appear as the people who bring the most important wisdom into the plays. The mad in Greek society were considered as touched by the gods, and their words were looked at almost as the words of oracles. But with the increasing, as it were, with the increasing rationalization, a word I've used a lot, and a word I used yesterday, rationalization of the world, the mad began to be shut away in asylums. At first, this was a brutal process, and later it became humanized. This is a word that Foucault does not like. In fact, he doesn't like humanism or the talk about humans. He's afraid every time he hears it that it is not a word of inclusion, but of exclusion, based on the history of the use of that word. I think African Americans can particularly relate to that, since only within the lifetime of a couple of generations have they become more than 3/5 human. They can understand what it means for it to be a term of exclusion. In any case, the great reformers of madness, the ones who wanted, as it were, to cure them, created what Foucault calls a whole new disciplinary matrix around madness. What that means is that the curing of them did not liberate them, it did not give them the value that they had at one time. No, it set up a whole series of processes within which they could be observed, drugged, analyzed, reanalyzed. And of course, I've joked about this process. I don't want to use the strong word madness here, but when we look at the expansion of this therapeutic zone on into the late 20th century, we now find out that very few of us don't belong in it. I mean, if you're not on a 12-step program today, you're out of fashion. I mean, who would have guessed that the discourse of madness would eventually cover the whole social field, and until perhaps the last growth industry we have, other than making movies about sex and violence, is psychiatry and running 12-step programs. This is a growth industry. This is one industry where you can, retrain yourself in midlife, since you don't need a degree to do this, actually, and set up a 12-step program. So for Foucault, this is not some great new humanistic advance in medicine that has liberalized the treatment of madness. It is a new form of control that's based on a new language about the mad. For example, we no longer call them morons and idiots. We call them the differently abled, and so on. But for Foucault, this new discourse is even more totalitarian, because behind it hides the same mechanisms of power, or not the same, but behind it hides mechanisms of power which keep these people in their sway. I think one of the greatest examples of this, for me, is the discourse concerning body weight in women, bulimia, anorexia, and so on. It's as though a male-dominant society was able in the Middle Ages to put a chastity belt on a woman, to put, to like keep food away from her and starve her if she misbehaved. But today we accomplish the same feat through images that are constantly bombarded into the conscious and to the unconscious of women, and they perform the wonderfully humanistic task of starving themselves to death, while male therapists teach them how to get on 12-step programs to eat. See, for Foucault, this is why it's not humanism. This kind of malady is a cultural malady that strikes at the very heart of life. Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself. And that makes it quite dramatic, actually. So that's an example of Foucault's account, that not from him, I made that one up. Foucault died of AIDS. He's not still alive, unfortunately. So he didn't get a chance to write that one on Fat and Skinny, but he wrote many others. On The Normal and the Deviant, he was in the process of writing a long book on the history of sexuality, and then ironically, before he could complete it, he died of AIDS. So the book I've decided to use is his famous work, and I'll show it to you and suggest that you all read it, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. And I intend to go through the argument in some detail, because it would be very much against the spirit of Foucault to give you all the abstractions about his position, but not give you the really important points where he works out in detail how these interlocking systems of knowledge and power actually function in his genealogies. That's the real meat of the story for him. So I'm going to go through this in some detail, at least the detail that the constraints of time allow me. Discipline and Punish begins with a very short chapter called The Body of the Condemned. And this is in the period, I think 17th, 18th century period. The king is at this period, and the history basically takes place in France, but similar practices were also taking place in England and in other of the countries that were on their way from merchant capital to an advancing capitalism. But still, this is pre-revolutionary France, so you still have a king, and France is run by the red and the black, the red of the church and the black of the army. It's a famous novel by Stendhal, for you people who still read novels, The Red and the Black. It's worth reading. But in any case, The Body of the Condemned begins with a famous and hideous passage, which if I read, then this tape will probably be censored.